Today, JL Collins is returning to the podcast. He was a previous guest. We discussed his two books, Simple Path to Wealth and Pathfinders. So they're Simple Path to Wealth, one of those iconic books about personal finance, financial independence. He's an advocate of index investing, saving large portions of your income and pursuing financial independence, getting FU money. That's one of the key things he's known for. Now he's releasing an updated edition of the Simple Path to Wealth, which we will discuss today. So welcome to the podcast, JL.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back, VSG.
Thanks for coming on. So we're recording this on April 11th. This probably won't come out for another month, but it's a wild time in the markets. A week ago, Trump dropped the biggest tariffs in 100 years. By the time you've listened to this podcast, maybe he'll have reversed it. Maybe he'll have doubled down. Who knows what's going to happen anyway. So from your perspective, JL, I mean, you've been investing since the 70s. You've seen all sorts of market turmoil, events. What is your take on the current volatility and the current situation we're seeing?
Oh, I'm so tempted to say what volatility I had noticed, but indeed I've noticed it's hard not to. And I put a post up on my blog talking about this, and in short, in that post I look back just a few short years ago when my blog comments and social media were lighting up with panic. And this time was different. This time it's a pandemic. This time economies are shutting down all over the world. This time people are dying. Certainly this time it's different. This time the simple path will no longer work. And my response to that was, you're right and you're wrong. You're right in that, yes, we haven't had a pandemic in 100 years, but the trigger that causes market collapses and bear markets and crashes, if that's what this evolves into, is always different. And it's always scary. And it always seems like the end of the world. That's why the market reacts negatively to them, right? But they never are. And the market always recovers and goes on. And then I talk about the decade between 2000 and 2010, which was probably the worst decade that we've had, well, since the 70s. And so for most people listening, the worst decade that they've experienced, and probably for a lot of people listening, that was before their time. But just to review, and we had the tech crash at the beginning of that decade when the stocks dropped 49%. And then at the end of the decade, we had the financial crisis where they dropped 56%. And during that decade, stocks on average gained about 2% a year, which, considering those crashes, is bookmarking it isn't bad, but it's certainly not great. Adjusted for inflation, by the way, it actually lost slightly. It was, I think, 0.6%, so a fraction of a percent negative per year. But if you look at that and you looked at the media during those times, it was the end of the world. It was all kinds of negative things. If you'd followed the simple path for that decade, you would have been staying the course, which meant that if you were building your wealth, you would have been steadily buying more and more shares over time, as you had been before and as you did after, and you would have been buying at what turned out to be bargain prices, and that would have profited you greatly. So that takes us up to today. As you alluded to, I have no idea where this is going. We sit here today, the market's been extraordinarily volatile. The president has stepped back from tariffs for 90 days, other than China, and there's a major trade war going on. By the time this releases, it could be entirely different. I don't know. Could be the worst is over. Could be that we're going to go into a multi-year decline, hopefully not as extensive as that decade I just described, but it's possible. But if you're on the simple path to wealth, you're investing for decades. And it really doesn't matter. If anything, it will create an advantageous buying opportunity to pick up more shares. And one of the things that people should realize when they look at their portfolio and they say, wow, The dollar value of my holdings has dropped maybe significantly. The important thing is you still own those same, unless you panic and sell, you still own those same number of shares. And now you have an opportunity to add to them at bargain rates. So declines should not phase people on the simple path.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned like the concern about like this time is different. Like every time it feels like this
Every
is
time's different.
this is the one. Do you take any pause with kind of just the kind of erratic things we've seen from the administration, where it seems like there's an erosion in rule of law and threats to the dollar's supremacy as the world's reserve currency? Do you ever worry that maybe this is different, or like do you think it's just kind of like in 10 years we'll just be in a totally different environment and have forgotten about all this?
Well, probably in 10 years, we'll be in a totally different environment. I mean, my guess is that in 5 years, the stock market will be higher than it is today.
Hmm.
If I go out 10 years, I feel even more certain about that. And if I go out 20 years, it's almost a guarantee, right? And yeah, it's always concerning. I mean, nobody really knew where the pandemic was going to take us, and nobody really knows where this political climate is going to take us. As they say in the blog post, maybe it'll turn out right. I mean, maybe I happen, for the record, I happen to think that the tariffs are a terrible and dangerous idea, to be clear. But if 50 years of investing has taught me anything, it's that I can't see the future. It's taught me humility. So right now, yeah, I don't think we're on a good path, but I could be wrong. Could be that things will turn out roses, like the president thinks they will with these tariffs. Could be that these are all a negotiating ploy, and by the time our conversation hits the air, those negotiations will be over and will be smooth sailing again. Could be some factor that nobody's even dreamed of that crops up to change it. And it could be, as I said, a multi-year decline. But I don't think it's the end of the country. And is it going to change the world order? Well, perhaps, maybe. But the world order has changed before. It used to be that Britain was the economic powerhouse of the world. It no longer is, but it's still a viable country with a viable economy and a viable stock market. So if the U.S. is dethroned from that position, it's not the end of the U.S. or our stock market or the opportunities to invest in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you zoom out, you can see like we still have some of the best companies in the world. Their opportunities might be limited by tariffs, but at the
Right.
end of the day, I think it's difficult to duplicate like an Apple or a Google or a Berkshire Hathaway. Like those companies are still there. They still have the same opportunities they did a year ago.
Well, and the important thing is that there are new companies coming up behind them.
Very good
Right?
point.
And because if you look at, the top companies in the United States at any given moment in time, they will be different. They are different than the top companies from before, and they'll be different than the ones in the future. And the nice thing about owning something like VTSAX, which is Vanguard's total stock market index fund, is that it doesn't matter if some of those companies drift away and lose their luster, they'll be replaced by other companies on the way up, and we will own those companies and we will benefit from it. Yeah, so they are great companies. The thing that would really concern me
Mhm.
is if I saw the United States taking serious steps away from capitalism. And capitalism these days is a loaded word, so let me quickly define what it actually means and how I'm using it. Capitalism is simply a system that allows individuals to own property. And in this case, we can own property, we can own businesses, we can own homes, we can own stocks. And for the simple path to work, you need a capitalist system that allows individuals to own things as opposed to the state owning everything. And then, of course, you need publicly traded companies that we can buy. And thanks to Jack Bogle, who created index funds back in 1975, we have the most efficient and expensive way to buy them. So never has there been a better time to be an investor than right now. But if we stepped away from that kind of system, if suddenly we were no longer able to buy publicly traded companies or own, well, then that would be game over. But even having said that, it's striking to me that my book, The Simple Path to Wealth, is published in China. That's not so striking because China, while it's ostensibly a communist country, has deeply embraced capitalism. And to China's benefit, by the way, to the degree they've embraced capitalism is the degree that they become wealthy. My book's also published in Russia. Russia's a little more mired in communism, a little less embracing capitalism, but still, I have readers in Russia who are following the simple path. So it seems to be applicable across an awful lot of environments.
Absolutely. Do you think it makes sense to have a more global portfolio to maybe reduce the risk of a situation where the US turns away from capitalism? Like maybe if we give up on it here, there's still other places in the world where it could be viable and they could be the economies of the future.
Yeah, certainly if I thought there was a genuine risk of us turning away from capitalism, I would absolutely be going global. I don't see that.
Mm,
I'm
okay.
I'm I'm not suggesting that that's where we're headed by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just pointing out that if you want to hear something that would give me pause as to the future, that would be along those lines. But no, I don't see that happening. It's interesting. I have been a proponent of investing only in the U.S., only in either an S&P 500 index fund or the total stock market index fund that I slightly prefer. And that's counter to the advice of most people writing about investing who say that you should also own international funds. And I just don't see the need because, well, several reasons, but the primary one is that our top companies in the United States are essentially international companies. So as the world expands and prospers, the companies, in the United States, our top companies expand and prosper with that growth. So we get to take advantage of that as well. Now, what's interesting is with the turmoil this year so far in the United States, for the first time in a long time, foreign markets are outperforming the U.S. market. The U.S. Market has kind of trounced the rest of the world for the last decade plus, but so far this year, that wheel has turned. That doesn't change my mind about not needing to own those things because that comes and goes. There are going to be times when the U.S. is not the dominant stock market in the world over decades. That's just a natural course of events. And then eventually the wheel turns and comes back. So I don't see that as a reason to suddenly expand into those markets. And having said all that, I also have always said that for those people who disagree with me on this, and for those people who say, no, I want to own those international companies and those international funds, you won't get any strong pushback from me. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I just personally don't see the need.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, as long as you're investing in kind of like a systematic way into companies that are generating earnings and cash flows, like over time, that should work out, you know.
That's very well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, very well said.
So another development since our last conversation is AI. So AI stocks exploded last year. They're falling apart now. How does AI make you feel about the future of our economy, of our stock market?
Well, that kind of goes back to an observation I made a few moments ago in that when you own something like VTSAX, again, the total stock market index fund, yeah, some of these stocks like Nvidia seemingly came out of nowhere to become dominant on the fund. Well, I didn't have to worry about figuring that out and figure out which companies in that same space didn't make it and fell to the wayside, right? Because these funds are cap weighted, which simply means that the larger the company, the greater percentage of the fund they represent. So as NVIDIA got bigger and bigger, it became a larger and larger portion of the fund, therefore a larger and larger portion of my holdings. It's true of all these AI companies. And then, if they fall out of favor, then they will drift away and be replaced by whatever comes next. And I certainly could not have predicted what was going to happen with AI companies. Nobody really did. And I can't predict where they're going from here or what will replace them or when. One of the criticisms that are leveled at these broad-based low-cost index funds that I favor, they'll say these days, VTSAX, the S&P 500, these are essentially tech funds because they are cap weighted and the top companies are all tech companies. Well, that's true today, but it wasn't always true. I mean, I remember a time when they were heavily weighted with energy companies. And you could have argued, oh, it's an energy fund, or financial services at one point, or consumer goods another point. In time, when you've been investing 50 years, you go through a lot of these things. And so right now it's technology. I don't know how long it will be technology. I don't know what will come behind it when that time comes. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to care because whatever it is, I'll own it as it comes up. That's the beauty of an index fund, and it's the process that I call self-cleansing. The old that lose their way fade off the index, and the new exciting companies rise to the top, and we benefit as owners.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like if you think back 25 years ago, for instance, most of the top companies at the top of the index didn't even necessarily exist back then or were publicly
Right,
traded. Like
right.
Google went public in '04. Netflix was a little micro cap stock. Facebook didn't even exist. And I'm sure 25 years from now, there will be some new crop of companies that things we've never even heard of right now. And you're right, the index will own it. Like the index will adapt over time through its design.
I gave a Google talk back in 2018, and of course, Google is one of the great companies these days, a very dominant company. And I was on a Google campus in Chicago giving this talk. It's by the way, it's become an incredibly popular talk. But in any event, I during that talk, I said, at some point, Google will fade away. I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know who's going to come along and eat your lunch. As I'm sitting here today, 7 years later, it hasn't happened. But there are lots of companies that are going to be created to try to take a piece of their business. And companies have life cycles, and the bigger and the more successful they get, the more cumbersome they become, the more complacent. So at some point, that'll happen to Google. I used to be able to say, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was created sometime in the late 1800s. I forget when. So well over 100 years ago. And I used to be able to say, can you guess how many of the original companies on the Dow are still on it? And, the answer to that question used to be one. It used to be General Electric, but about 10 years ago, General Electric fell off. So now the answer is none. None of the original Dow Industrial Average companies are still there to make up the current Dow Industrials. So that's illustrative. Companies come and go.
Yeah, and it's crazy because in the moment, those top companies always seem kind of invincible. It's like I think if you went back to 2000 and told anyone back then what happened to GE, they wouldn't believe you. It's just crazy how it changes over time.
My favorite example of that, and this might not be relevant to our listeners because it might be too old for them, but Sears,
Right.
Sears Roebuck and Company. So Sears was a company that started in the 1800s. And by the 1970s, when I was coming out of college, it was a phenomenally dominant company. It was the Walmart and Amazon combined of its time. In fact,
Yeah.
Sears had its start very much like Amazon. They were retail brick and mortar stores to begin with. And then they figured out they could print catalogs and mail them out to rural areas that had no access to stores. and people would buy stuff and they'd mail it to them. I mean, just what Amazon's doing today. And at the same time, they had lots of brick and mortar stores like Walmart does. So they were hugely dominant when I was a kid and a young man. They built in Chicago what was at the time the Sears Tower and the tallest building in the world. Now you'd be hard pressed to find a Sears store. It just disappeared. If back in those days you had said you had gone to Sears and given a talk and told those people that their lunch was going to get eaten like I did for Google, they would have laughed at you. But here we are. And it still stuns me that Sears, that I can't go into a Sears store, and which I used to do. I mean, and I used to love Sears. It was great.
Yeah. And then they've had some spin-offs that have been successful, but it's just funny, like the way
Yeah.
things change like that. Cool. So another thing I wanted to ask you about, so another trendy thing to talk about among like the macro commentators is the idea of a passive bubble, that there's so much money going into passive investing that it's propping up valuations and it's destroying price discovery. What would you say to those people?
I would say it's utter nonsense, right? I would say this is a trope that's trotted out primarily, I think, I don't know this, but I'm assuming by people who have a vested interest in promoting actively managed funds, because actively managed funds can charge more in fees and they're very, very lucrative for the people who run them. I saw a report recently, and my memory is just not good enough to remember the details. But the truth is, the amount of stocks that are in passive indexes is still a very small portion of the total.
Mhm.
And the largest portion of the total are still stocks that are traded actively. And the argument, of course, is that if too much becomes passive, then you lose the pricing mechanism that active trading, that is, buyers and sellers actively deciding what they're willing to accept and what they're willing to pay for a given stock, which is how it sets the value, that you lose that. And that's an important part of the process, and it is. But the fact is that there is more than enough trading going on. And the other thing to consider is if you go back 50 years, as I do as an investor, and you look at the volume of trading that was done, and this is before there was any passive investing, any index investing, right?
Mhm.
The volume of trading that was done that was setting those prices effectively in those days, or at least everybody felt it was effective, is a fraction of the volume of trading that goes on today, a tiny fraction of it. So no worries on this score. There is more than enough buying and selling amongst traders to set values of stocks. Indexing is a long, long, long way from impinging on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you look at, I think a good example of that is when you look at the volatility in some of the top names in the index. Like if we're just as simple as like the top names in the index get fueled with capital and they're going to rise and never fall. Like you don't really see that. I mean, like a couple of years ago, Facebook fell to like 5 times earnings and now it's back. And like if that was true, I don't think you'd see that kind of volatility for the top names.
Right. I mean, you see it happening to NVIDIA now. NVIDIA's kind of fallen out of favor after it skyrocketed. No, there's this idea that these top names in the index are locked in there because of capital flows is just not accurate. It's just
Mhm.
not what actually happens.
And I think you're right with what you said at the beginning, where a lot of it is like active managers saying, well, you need me. Like that's basically the gist of it. It's like everything's screwed, so that's why you need me to
Yeah.
save you.
Yeah. And unfortunately, the research doesn't support that.
Right.
Yeah, the research is the vast majority, well, depending on how far out you go, in any given year, there's about 20% of active managers that actually outperform the index. If you got 30 years, it drops to less than 1%, which is
Right.
statistically zero. So, yeah, I mean, active management does not have a great track record of outperforming the basic index. So that's very hard for people to accept because it seems like it should be easy to do, right?
Mhm.
But and that's what kept me from embracing indexing for way too long is because I was, I bought individual stocks I was researching and buying actively managed funds for a long time, and I did pretty good results, but not as good as I would have gotten from the index fund. And it certainly took a whole lot more effort. And once that finally got through my thick skull, and it took a while, I made the switch. But yeah, I mean, my life would have been a lot easier, a lot simpler, and a lot more profitable if I'd embraced indexing sooner.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm kind of jealous actually of people who read my book now because I wandered in the wilderness for decades figuring this stuff out. And now you can read my book and skip over all of that and just embrace index funds to your benefit right away. My daughter did that. And
Nice.
yeah, she's in her early 30s and financially independent now. So,
Fantastic. Yeah, I remember if I remember the book correctly, you originally were introduced to the idea of indexing in 1985, and then you resisted it for 15 years or so. Is that right?
that's pretty close. So the a little to add to that, yeah, you're spot on. But to add to it a little bit, I started investing in 1975, which just
Mhm.
coincidentally was the year that Jack Bogle created the first index fund, which was an S&P 500 fund. I didn't know that at the time,
Mhm.
and as you just correctly said, I didn't learn about index funds until about 1985. But sometimes I think, wow, if I'd known about them in 75 and had I been smart enough to embrace them in 1975, the past 50 years would have been a lot easier and a lot more lucrative. But I didn't know about them, and I know I wouldn't have been smart enough to embrace them because, as you charmingly pointed out, I wasn't smart enough in 1985 to embrace them when I did hear about it. So there you go. Yeah, it took me, well, I guess, this is embarrassing, but 25 years to figure it out.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to get, and you're right. It does seem like I still pick stocks for fun, and then I have a small account for that, but I've kind of accepted it's really hard to beat the market, so you should just kind of go along with it. But yeah, it is so intoxicating and fun to pick stocks. And it does seem like it should be so easy to do it. Like
Right.
when you look at some of the companies that are out there, it's like, well, this is obviously a dud. And then, oftentimes when I look at like my stock picking portfolio, I can like the names that do the best shock me. It's like I wouldn't have expected that. Like Dollar General, for instance,
Yeah.
this year is up like 22%. And the news is just terrible about Dollar General. And I would have never picked that to be like the best performer out of the bunch. And it's just I just think it's a fun hobby. It's something to do for fun, but beyond that, I think
Well, I call it the disease.
yeah,
And,
I have the
and,
disease. There you
and I have the disease too.
go.
As you alluded to, there is nothing more intoxicating than finding a company, researching the stock, deciding, okay, this one's gonna go somewhere, buying it, and then having it work
Mhm.
and watching it go up. There's few things, as somebody would say, I can't think of anything more intoxicating with your clothes on than that. But it's not always the experience. And like you say, it's sometimes the things that seem like obvious duds. Well, the next thing you know, that's the exciting turnaround story. And the ones that seem like obvious winners, turn into the next Enron, where it just collapsed because it turns out they were cooking the books and nobody knew. So it's just, yeah, they're very painful lessons to learn when you have the disease. But yeah, I'm recovering,
There
and
you go.
it's like one day at a time. But I'm tempted all the time.
Gotcha. So what do you think about that idea of like someone just kind of having money that's in ETFs and funds and that type of thing, and then just keeping a small account to kind of play the game? What do you think about that kind of approach?
I, I I'm going to give you a slightly different answer than my traditional answer. My traditional answer is I'm not in favor of it.
Hmm.
Because I don't expect my money to entertain me, and I once did because as we just talked about, it was very intoxicating.
Yeah.
But But now all I expect my money to do is make more money for me, and it will do that most reliably in the index funds. And when I want to be entertained, I look elsewhere. Now, having said that, I've softened that stance a little bit to the extent that if you are currently financially independent, if you are currently wealthy, and you are comfortably more wealthy than you need to be just to provide the bare minimum of your living. The definition of financial independence is your investments are throwing off enough to pay your bills. If you've just got barely enough to do that, then you're not in the category I'm thinking of. But if you have enough to do that and then some, and maybe considerably some, well, then sure, go ahead and play. I mean, if that gives you satisfaction, and maybe you'll hit the lottery doing that and you enjoy it, but I wouldn't recommend it when you're building your wealth.
Absolutely.
Because you're probably going to outperform. Almost certainly, you will outperform with that portion of your portfolio, and that's just a drag on getting to the goal of being financially independent. But once you're there, and you're comfortably there, and then I think for somebody like you, I'd probably say sure. But like I say, it's an addiction, a disease, and speaking for myself, I've learned I'm just better off saying no to it all.
I hear you. So getting into the new edition of the book, so what are some of the biggest updates and additions to the new version of the book that's coming out?
Yeah. So first of all, we went through. If anybody's read the original, the first thing I'll say is the basic philosophy is unchanged. So the simple path to wealth remains the simple path to wealth. But the first thing we did is go through the book and update all of the different specific numbers. So, things like the rules and amounts around 401ks and IRAs. The book has a lot of what if analysis. So I went up and went in and updated all of those scenarios based on the fact that now I'm looking at a 50-year database rather than a 40-year. So in the original, which I was writing in 2015, published it in 2016, I just chose because I started investing in 1975, that 40-year period. Well, now I've got a 50-year period. And by the way, one of the striking things about that is when I was doing the original book and I looked at I thought, I ought to look up the actual performance of the S&P 500 over these past 40 years, because there's been a lot of turmoil over that period of time, right? You had stagflation, you had the Black Monday in 1987, you had the tech crash, you had the financial crisis, you had multiple wars, all kinds of terrible things happened in that 40-year period. Turns out, kind of to my horror, that the market posted an annual average return of 11.9%. And when I was writing the book, I thought, man, I do not for a second want to suggest to anybody that they can count on that kind of return for their future planning. But at the same time, that's what the market actually did. And so I make that point very clear in the original book that, here are the actual numbers, and I use that in some of my what if scenarios. But I'm by no means suggesting you can count on this kind of return going forward. So when I had 50 years of data, and now, the COVID crisis and the bear market in 2022, this was before the current turmoil that we're in. I thought, well, I wonder how it's done in 50 years. And over adding these last 10 years, it's actually gone up an average of 12.2% a year. So even better. But I thought that was striking. Anyway, getting back to your questions. So we updated all the numbers. It's reorganized a little bit. There's a whole new section called Toolkit with some cool things in it. One of my favorite things is an FAQ section for the first time, where I went through and looked at all the questions I've gotten over the last decade from people who've read the book about things that were not necessarily addressed in the book. And so I respond to those, and some things that have happened, like cryptocurrency. That's a question I get a lot. What do I think of crypto? Well, that's not in the book, but it's in the FAQ section. I also added a new case study about my friend Tom, who everything in Tom's life financial went wrong. He wound up at the age of 62 with multiple divorces, bankrupt, lost his house. I mean, lost everything at a time when he was essentially unemployable in his profession. And yet, Tom was then and remains probably the happiest person I personally have ever met. So that's just an illustration that it's not all about money, because I found sometimes the people who read my work worry way too much about this stuff. I think most people probably don't worry about it enough, but the kind of people who listen to this podcast and read my work probably worry about it too much. If you're listening to podcasts like this, reading books like The Simple Path to Wealth, you're going to be fine. So that's the purpose of having that story. So that's a few of the things that occur to me off the top of my head.
Interesting. Yeah. So for the 10 years of data, I find that very funny because so it returned 12.2%, used to do 11.9 because in 2015,
Well, that
people
was
are
over 50 years, by the way.
right. But I mean,
But
basically the metric hasn't changed all that
right,
much.
right.
And it's just funny to me that there's all these sophisticated models for predicting future returns. And it's probably best to just look to the history.
Well, it's interesting. Jack Bogle, who started Vanguard and created the first index fund, and in my opinion, is a fiscal saint, and
Hmm.
he's passed away now. Even Jack Bogle, about 7 years ago, when he was still alive, was coming out and saying, for the next 10 years, investors need to expect much lower returns in the range of maybe 4% a year. Well, the last 10 years have pulled the previous 40 up from 11.9 to 12.2, right? So the last 10 years did something better than 12.2. It's just, and again, not to say that we can expect that going forward,
Yeah.
but very much to say that if Jack Bogle doesn't get it right, nobody's going to get it right. I mean, Jack Bogle was about as savvy an investor as ever walked the planet.
Hmm.
And if he doesn't get it right, I'm not going to get it right. You're not going to get it right. Nobody's listening to us. Maybe the next decade will be a decade like, the first one of this century where, it returns 2% a year. Or maybe it'll go on to return 18% a year, which, we've had recent, I think from 2010 to 2020 did something along those lines. There's just nobody knows where it's going to go. But ultimately, the market is very volatile, has wild swings. And boy, the last week of trading is the perfect example of that. But ultimately, it marches continually up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we had one day where it was up 10%. So it
Yeah.
can get things can get pretty wild. But yeah,
Yeah.
it just cracks me up that there's so many investors who have these models about here's what it's going to do and no one knows. No one knows
So,
anything.
no, this again is going to date me, and probably a lot of people listening can't relate to this, but back in the 80s and 90s, there was a guy named Louis Rukeyser. He used to have
Oh,
yeah, he
it was
used
great. I watched it when I was a kid. Yeah.
oh yeah, Louis was wonderful. He's now passed away, but he had every Friday night, and it was my Friday night ritual. He had a half-hour program called Wall Street Week, and Louis would start the program giving his commentary on what had happened on the market that week, and then he'd have a panel of guests, and the guests were always impeccably credentialed, exceedingly bright people. And Louis would add, and he always had three, and it was rotating. He didn't always have the same three. And he'd ask these, again, impeccably credentialed people, what they predicted for the future. And they very confidently predicted things. Sometimes they were right, but what's striking to me is they contradicted each other. So, equally credentialed people saw the future very differently. And sometimes they were right, sometimes they were wrong. I remember there was a guy that one of my favorites was Marty Zweig. And Marty Zweig was always, Louis, I'm worried about this market. I mean, I never saw Marty on the program where he didn't say, I'm worried about this market. He was chronically worried. And then there was Abby Joseph Cohen, And Abby was always relentlessly bullish, and it was fun to watch, but it taught me that nobody, nobody knows what the market's going to do next. Unless you go out 5, 10, 20 years, and then I'm pretty confident then the market's going to be up. But if you're talking about what it's going to do tomorrow or next week or next month or next year or even the next couple of years, nobody knows.
Yeah, I think Abby Joseph Cohen, I think she predicted Dow 10,000 in like 1990. She said by the end of the decade, it'll hit 10,000.
Well, that was outrageous.
Yeah, and I was like, this,
Yeah.
this, this is crazy town. And that's
Yeah,
exactly what
right, right,
happened.
right, right, right.
Uh, Interesting. Yeah. So you mentioned the story about Tom, how he made these missteps, but he's very happy in life. Like what are some of the things we can learn from that story?
Yeah, so first of all, I was doing another podcast interview and I was asked, is Tom a real person? And yeah, Tom is a real person. He's a friend of mine. I got to know Tom in the 90s. He was in those days, he was a client of mine. And he worked in an advertising agency. So he was in the agency business and in the automotive world. And that's where Tom had spent his career. And he was a very successful guy, very smart guy, very successful guy. But as I alluded to earlier, Tom went through a couple of marriages, a couple of divorces, several kids, and divorces are expensive.
Hmm.
And Tom was not somebody who was following something like the simple path to wealth. Tom led a what I think is probably a fairly typical American lifestyle in that he spent what he earned pretty fully. He wasn't making major mistakes like going deeply into credit card debt, but he spent everything. And then he was accumulating pretty large levels of expense. And then at one point, and he would move from job to job, which I did in my career, which was kind of typical of this generation. But at one point, especially in the advertising agency world, it's a young person's game.
Hmm.
And Tom simply aged out and he could no longer find a job in his profession. And when you're dependent on that certain level of income and you don't have assets to fall back on, that rapidly becomes ugly. And Tom, by the way, tells this case study in his own words, which is in the book for those who are interested in reading it. But Tom wound up at the age of 62, bankrupt. His house was repossessed. The only thing that the judge let him keep, and Tom kind of pleaded for this, and the judge sort of granted it, I guess, out of courtesy or good graces or whatever. But Tom had a gun collection, antique guns, and the judge let him keep that. But that was the only thing that he wound up with. And at that point, he took Social Security because you can take Social Security at 62. You get a very vastly reduced benefit. But when you don't have another source of income, that's what you have to do. He also had a very small pension from one of the places that he'd worked. And then Tom's a Michigan boy, lives in the Detroit area. He got a job at the Henry Ford Museum, which is, I forget where it is, in Dearborn, I think. And they have a farm on the museum grounds that is like from the 1800s.
Hmm.
So they show people how farming was done in the 1800s. And it's an actual operating farm. And they have people who work the farm, who dress in period costume, and who will explain to the tourists what they're doing and how things were done back in the day. And that's what Tom now does.
Oh, okay.
He's outside doing physical exercise, getting work. He's a good-looking guy. He looks great in the period costume. He's a very charming, engaging guy, and he loves doing it. And it's provides a little supplement to his Social Security and that little pension that he has. And he's rebuilt his life. He now has bought another house. It's very small, very modest. I've been there. Very small, modest house in a Detroit suburb. And, because Tom is a very optimistic, engaging personality. He has a girlfriend. And yeah, I mean, Tom's doing great. Again, he's one of the happiest people I've ever met. And yet, financially, he's got one of the worst stories I've ever heard. And yet his life has turned out fine because of his attitude. And, what he projects out in the world attracts people to him. So he's got great friends. He's got a great relationship with a woman, and he's got a great job that he's really good at. He's healthy, and so yeah, I think when I hear people that are following my simple path and they've done it successfully and they've got sometimes several $1 million, and they're like, I'm so worried about the future. Well, you need to read Tom's story and maybe you won't worry so much.
Hmm. And do you think that's the most important takeaway from that story is the attitude, is making sure that, no matter what, that you maintain a good positive attitude?
Yeah, I think that's important. My book starts out, the original did, and the new version also starts out with the parable of the monk and the minister. And real briefly, that's the story of their two boyhood friends, right? And they grow up and they go their separate ways. And one of them goes off and becomes a minister to the king, very wealthy, very successful. And the other goes off and becomes a monk.
Hmm.
And years later, they run into each other on the road. And the minister of the king is dressed in his fine robes, and the monk is in his shabby cloak and, with holes in it and patches, and he's carrying his little begging bowl. And they embrace each other. It's as the old friends do, and they get to talking. And the minister kind of feels sorry for his shabby, poverty-stricken monk friend, and he says, he says, if you could learn to cater to the king, you wouldn't have to live on rice and beans. To which the monk replies, if you could learn to live on rice and beans, you wouldn't have to cater to the king. The point of that parable is
Yeah.
that, we all fall somewhere on that spectrum. And I think I fall a little, I'm certainly not the monk, but I fall closer. And I think it's important to be willing to embrace the ethic of the monk and understand that keeping body and soul together, staying fed with a roof over your head, doesn't take that much in this country. And a lot can go wrong, as it did for Tom, and you can still do those basic things. You might not have the luxury car, the two least luxury cars, and the McMansion and the skiing trips, but you don't need to spend money to be happy. So I think that's the lesson there. And doesn't mean you shouldn't have money. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have a nice car if that's what floats your boat, or take nice vacations. But it does mean that you should have a little perspective on those things and not worry so much, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is funny. Like, as Americans, the things like when you talk about financial independence, the things that we describe as like, here are some things you can do to save money. Like, we, as Americans, we tend to think of it as such deprivation, but it's not really deprivation. Like, to, not go to a restaurant every day and have a luxury car, and like, you're right. Like, as long as you're meeting the essentials, that ought to be fine. It's not really extreme deprivation to be able to save some money.
Yeah, that's a great point, and if I can spend a little bit of time on it,
Sure. Yeah.
so I when I came out of college, it was in the '70s, which was a very bad economic time. It took me 2 years to get my first professional job, which paid $10,000 a year. Now, adjusted for inflation, obviously, would that amount would be more today, but that's what it was then. And I had been working in landscaping between college and getting that job to, pay my bills. And I looked at $10,000 a year, and I thought I can live on half of that.
Mhm.
It's half of that. 5,000 a year was more than I was making landscaping. It was a whole lot more than I was living on putting myself through college. I knew other people who were living on that. So I said, I want to do that because I want to spend the other $5,000 buying the most important thing to me money can buy, which was my freedom. And you buy your freedom by acquiring assets that steadily provide more and more of the income you need to live in our culture, right? And so it never felt like deprivation to me because it was a choice of how I was going to spend my money. I was spending it on the single most important thing to me, which again was my freedom, and that meant buying assets. It's if you're looking to buy a car and you're saying, well, I could buy a Chevy or I could buy a Cadillac and have a fancier car. Well, your analysis is going to be, or, if I buy the Chevy, then I've got extra money to do other things with. So which do I want, the Chevy and the extra money, or do I want that fancy Cadillac? That's the kind of thought process we all go through in deciding where we're going to allocate our money.
Hmm.
And what I'm suggesting to people who read my book is there is an option that you certainly haven't been taught in our culture in all probability. You're probably not aware of, and that is you could spend some of that money buying your freedom. For me, I can't imagine anything I'd rather spend money on. Now, I keenly recognize that not everybody thinks that way. And lots of people who come across the simple path to wealth and this concept of spending their money, not in deprivation, but eagerly to buy the most important thing, well, that might be different for them than it is for me. But at least if they read my book, they will realize that this is an option, that this is something they could have done. I mean, how tragic to come to the later years of your life, essentially having no assets to fall back on, kind of like Tom did, and to suddenly realize you could have made different choices along the way that would have bought you this financial freedom. But it never felt to me like deprivation because, again, I was spending my money precisely the way I wanted to spend it. And I would have been uncomfortable spending it in any other fashion. But I think that probably describes you. It probably describes a lot of people listening to us, but we're all unicorns. Most people don't think this way, and our entire culture is structured to convince people to spend their money on all kinds of stuff other than buying their freedom. So, I don't expect very many people to follow this path, but I I want as many people as possible to at least know that it's a possibility so that for those for whom it does resonate, it's available.
Yeah, it's true. Like most people don't retire with a lot of retirement savings. And you kind of see that when you see like all the reverse mortgage commercials and things like that.
Yeah.
Like most people just have their home equity and they haven't really saved a significant amount of money and they're very reliant on Social Security in their retirement years generally.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's tragic.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. When some just very small changes, just cutting back on the lifestyle a little bit doesn't have to be extreme deprivation. Investing the difference can give you a very nice retirement.
And I think we need to break, and we talked about this a little bit already, but to really question this concept that to be happy, to live a full life means spending money.
Yeah, that's a good
Because
point.
it just doesn't. Now I have money and I spend money and I on things that I enjoy, and yes, that adds to my life. But if I didn't have the money, and didn't do the traveling that I've done, well, I'd still be doing other things that would make me happy, right? So your happiness is not tied to your spending.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that we're kind of taught that it is. I even see some people in the FI community, the financial independence community, and I understand the impulse because there are a lot of people who achieve financial independence by living a fairly frugal lifestyle, which is how you get there. And but then they're afraid to spend money on things that might make their life better, and
Hmm.
that's not good either. So if you're sitting on a pile of money and you would really like to be driving a nice car that you could easily at that point pay cash for, and you choose not to just because you can't bring yourself to spend the money, I think that's a problem.
Hmm.
what I object to is this idea that if you have money for a fancy car, as an example, and you don't buy it, there's something wrong, right? I mean, so you shouldn't feel that you have to spend money to be happy. If you have money and there's something you really want that you think would make your life better and you're not spending it, you probably need to rethink that. But I wouldn't listen to anybody who says, wow, you've got $5 million. You should be spending this money on these things. Well, no, it's your money. You can do whatever you want with it. Yeah.
That's true. Like I think most people would look back to college and they probably had a great time and we're broke. So you
I,
don't
you
need to
know,
spend a lot to do it.
I was talking to a friend of mine just the other day about that very subject. And I said, the poorest I have ever been in my life was in college because I was
Mhm.
putting myself through college. And those were probably my favorite 4 years of my life. It was an ideal blend of a little bit of work, being college coursework, that was interesting work, a lot of very interesting people to engage with, and lots of free time to engage with them. I mean, there wasn't, I didn't have any money, but nobody else had any money either. So
Yeah,
that didn't matter. Yeah, it was great.
absolutely. So, yeah, so for my last question, I thought it was great that your daughter helped with this new edition of the book. So, how did that process go? And how did that go for you?
Yeah, that's my favorite part of personally, my favorite part about having done this. And it was pretty unexpected, to be perfectly honest, because when I first started thinking about what to do with the book, I reached out to her and I said, whatever I decide is going to affect me. I'm an old guy. It's going to affect me for maybe a decade. It will impact you for probably half a century, right? And so maybe you ought to be part of this thought process. And we got to talking about it, and she's like, "Yeah, I'd really like to see you do this update that you're talking about." And to my great surprise, she wanted to be a part of making it happen, and she was a very active part played a very active role in the editing of the book and the updating of it. And it was immensely gratifying to me. My daughter and I have always had a great relationship, but now we're working on, something that's very important to me,
Hmm.
the book on a subject that's very important to me that turns out is also very important to her. And I didn't realize, I knew she was following the simple path to wealth because, as I say, it's taken her, I don't know if she's fully financially independent yet, but taken her very close to it. But I didn't realize how deeply she understood the process.
Mm.
And that was just, and I wrote this, I started the blog in 2011 and then wrote the book originally in 2015 for my daughter. Because when she was young, I turned her off to all this financial stuff, and I was kind of afraid I'd lost her. And so, as she's now an adult, for me to learn how deeply she values it and how thoroughly she understands and embraces it, and how incredibly helpful she was in the process of creating this new edition. I mean, it's the highlight of the whole thing for me. Yeah.
Awesome. Your blog started for her, right? Like you were like this,
Exactly.
oh, that's how this whole project got going. So it's cool to
Yeah.
have this stage of the process. She's the one contributing to it.
She used to tease me, and well, she still teases me. She says, Dad, if I'd listened to you when I was young, there'd be no blog, there'd be no book, there'd be no Chautauquas, which were the events I used to run. She'd, and nobody would want to interview you. And she's right. I mean, I started doing all of this so this information would be available to her if and when the time came she was ready to hear it. Because again, I came to think of her as a little girl who wouldn't listen. And that was my fault because I pushed it too hard too soon and turned her off to it. So yeah, it worked.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's given me probably one of the best decades of my life is doing this stuff. Yeah, actually, it's a little more. It's almost 15 years now. But yeah, it's been a great run in my later years.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Well,
I'm a lucky man.
Absolutely. So any parting words of wisdom for the audience?
I think we've covered a lot of it in this moment of turmoil. I think I would say, stay the course, tie yourself to the mast, don't panic and sell when the market, I've said that whether the market's very volatile, it's a great wealth building tool, but you have to be willing to endure the volatility. And whether the market makes you wealthy or leaves you bleeding at the side of the road depends on what you do when it's falling. And if you panic and sell when it's dropping, it's going to leave you bleeding by the side of the road.
Mm.
If you roll over, go back to sleep, and just continue to invest in it like you were doing before, you'll be picking up shares at bargain prices. Eventually, it'll turn around, and that's how it will make you wealthy.
Awesome message. Well, thank you for your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for coming on.